I will not take any more time, but here's Nick Meynen with the future of Europe's extractivism in a multipolar world.
Thank you, Fieke. Thank you, Tobias. Thank you, everyone, for being here. As we start 10 minutes late, I suggest I just get cracking. However, I do foresee interaction with the audience. I think you all deserve that. So my plan, in short, is I'll be talking around 30 minutes, mostly a monologue. However, the group is small enough, so please do interrupt me for clarification questions. And then we still have time for debate afterwards for the more in-depth questions. So that's how I plan to do it. My methodology, if you can call it like that, probably not. I start always with some storytelling. Well, maybe I should tell a little bit about me, story of me. Who am I? Well, I did geography, conflict science, and investigative journalism. Graduated 20 years ago. Went into NGO work, journalist work. The last 15 years, mostly at the EU level, environmental NGO field. And on the side, always been a journalist. And more opinion maker. Just a week ago, I had 5 pieces in the Standard, which is the main newspaper in Belgium, one of the main. And I also have a few books. So I have a few hats, and you might recognize some of these hats here. What I'm not is a PhD scientist. That's what you are or becoming. So bear with me if the exact methodology or nuance is maybe not up to your game. So I'm gonna bring some stories. Then the context for these stories is just to open the mind, basically. And then the context and some data, of course. And then where it all adds up to, according to my humble opinion, what it means at the EU level, what are we meaning a lot of concerned citizens trying to do about the current situation, the levels of change that we are trying to work at, and then making a little bridge from my story to the story of ICT, because I think that's the week you're here about. So while I'm not an ICT expert, I have a few bridge things. So is that clear already? What we're gonna do? Yeah, okay. Oh, I love these hand signals. Like that means yes. Okay, cool. Thanks. First story. Who knows this building? Yep, I think I saw a hand. You know the building. Try. Yes, St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the main cathedral of London, a very important holy building, right? So what happened in 2008 was that the people in the city of London, walking to their desk of their financial institution, opening their Financial Times to check on the stock rates, they saw this picture in the Financial Times. It was an ad. It's a bit unusual to see these kind of pictures in the Financial Times. What was also happening on the same day was that 2 Indian people walked into the St. Paul's Cathedral, looked around, knocked on some of the stonework and said, yeah, great stones. Where is the mining authority of London? Because I want to submit a mining license for this place. And they had some journalists with them, filming them and interviewing them. So that was the same day. A third piece of the puzzle what was also happening on that day. There was a shareholder meeting of a company called Vedanta. It's a mining company with a lot of operations in India, but with a London Stock Exchange listing and a headquarters in London. So every year the shareholders meet and they agree on the set course for the company. One of the items on the agenda was opening a $7 billion project in India for a new mining operation. You can start, if you connect the 3 pieces of the puzzle, get an idea why these Indians were doing what they were doing. Because for them, this is where they came from, these 2 Indians, the Niyamgiri Hills in Orissa in India. It's full of bauxite, which is useful to make aluminium, which is what the company was after for. However, for them, this is their cathedral. This is where their nature gods live. It's also their source for wood, food, water, medicine, so for life, which you can't say of the St. Paul's Cathedral in London, where they were taking a little bit of a revenge on their situation. What did they do for the 10 years before they came to London? Everything they could do in India. So they had their protests, their sit-ins, their strikes, their petitions, even their court cases up to the Supreme Court of India to say stop to this mining project, because it would basically take away all these hills, just dig them off, so that the source of water for the whole area around it would be gone. And they would end up in a slum of some Indian megacity. However, after 10 years, this sword of Damocles was still over their heads. And then people in the UK started to notice their protests. They invited them to London. They did this media stunt. And actually, it worked. Because a famous politician from India, Rahul Gandhi, he was in London. He saw it on the news. He started doing some phone calls, like, what's going on? I mean, it seems like a really bad project, and they're approving this here in London. And then there was more media reactions to the stunt. And in the end, one major investor felt like, maybe we should sell our stock in Vedanta because it's giving us bad publicity. And that major investor was the Church of England. So they didn't like it that the revenge was coming at them at the St. Paul's Cathedral. So this was a very smart action from these people in connection with a group in the UK, which actually led to a result, being the project was cancelled. The stock price of this Vedanta company didn't just halve, it went a factor 4 down. $7 billion was at stake. So this is one of the examples where I was reminded of a certain famous Hollywood movie. And here I'm going to ask you again, does this ring a bell? Do you think of a Hollywood movie? Fantastic movie. If you hear this story. I see someone doubting there, no? No? And if I show this? Who has seen the movie? Yeah, a few of you. Those who haven't, Avatar, long story short, animation, but mining company goes to far away planet, tries to grab the resources, finds local people living there in harmony with nature. They happen to be in the way, so they just think with our power, we push them aside. It'll work until the locals find a way to unite, and together they fight this David versus Goliath struggle, and they win. And these kind of stories, actually, it might even be that the Avatar movie was inspired by the one story that I told you about. There are some hints at that. But this is not a unique story, nor is it only a Hollywood movie. Actually, there are at least 4,000 of these kind of stories that we know of enough in detail to have the largest database of environmental conflicts in the world. I've worked 10 years with hundreds of people all over the world on filling this database with cases and mapping it, and then writing reports, policy briefings, stories, blogs, and so forth. I was a spokesperson for a project that was essentially between scientists from University of Barcelona, the ICTA group there, Juan Martinez Allier, Federico de Maria, and a bunch of hundreds of activists all over the world who gave the raw data, which were then validated and verified by the scientists before they came on the atlas. So egatlas.org is a nice resource to look at. Why? You can filter this atlas on any way you want. So if you're after conflicts caused by a certain bank, you type the name of the bank in the filter and you see which conflicts they are funding, or a certain resource, whether it's lithium, for example, you show the lithium conflicts, and then you can click and you see all the details. So that's going from a story to stories to some contexts, that these kind of struggles are everywhere. This is the global movement for environmental justice, trying to fight back against an expanding global economy that's rubbing at the edges of the earth, of the easy resources have been taken already. So now we're moving into places where people live, biodiversity hotspots, and people are resisting that. This is basically the resistance to the growth economy in real life. And so a bit more context, I think who of you have heard of this quite impactful academic paper, The Great Acceleration? Yes, a few of you have. So thank you for that. And those who haven't, it's really worth looking up. Half of the room has already read it, which gives you an idea of how important it is. Basically, there was an exposition about it in Paris. I had a few hours left, and so I went there, and this was at the entry of this exposition. And for me, that was like, wow. Because what it shows is 250 years, from 1750 to now, of key parameters of humanity and Earth. You have population growth, you have GDP growth, and then you have things like fresh water use, fertilizer use, and then here at the end, black line is international travel movements. And what all these trends have in common, at least to some degree, is that at first the rise was linear until somewhere here, the rise became exponential. And that's the problem, because you can't have this kind of exponential eternal growth on a finite planet. You create all these conflicts through that. And that's the message from that scientific paper in a nutshell as well. And so, yeah, you can pin it down to somewhere around just after Second World War, when then, first was a social welfare state, and then later neoliberalism came and added some steroids to the capitalist system, after which this happened. And the advantage of the whole Corona crisis is that most people now understand that the difference between linear rising curves and exponentially rising curves. And that when the latter happen, we get lockdowns and really big problems. So we should now try to find a way to apply this basic knowledge among society to also apply it on the Earth's state of play. Because these exponentially rising curves also need to flatten and even decline. So to make this concrete, coming closely towards the topic of extraction in Europe. So here are some examples of what that means, these big trends, these mega trends. This is the case of copper. So until like 1900, as humanity started digging copper centuries, even millennia before, the easy resources, which are at the surface, easy to access, were already taken. So we started moving into the harder places. We needed 50 tons of digging to take 1 ton of copper. Today, it's already 200 tons of digging to take 1 ton of copper, because all the good resources are taken. And the trend lines, so this is the actual measurements, and this is the modeling. And you can also see the modeling here is actually more upbeat than the reality. So the reality is we're running out, and copper is like one of the cornerstones of our economy. Another cornerstone is wood. So what happens when suddenly you have new legislation in favor of renovations, like they had at some point in the US? Well, suddenly everyone starts renovating. So suddenly the price of wood is doing this. See here? Well, the same is true for Belgium. I mean, just look at wood prices in Belgium the last 4 years. We have, and that's maybe also a good thing, halved the number of wood we take out of the woods, partly for economic reasons, partly this is already climate change damage. There are sometimes long periods where it's just too wet to get any woods out of the forest. So all of this leads to increase in price of wood. In general, building materials, and here you see already the link with geopolitics. Ukraine invasion, right? Somewhere here. So the price of building materials, whether it's wood or other, is increasing if global instability is declining, because you have a smaller number of markets to tap into. I'm going to take one more example after copper and wood, and in general building materials. And that example starts with this building. So here we go with a quiz of buildings. Which building is this one? Anyone? Yes, Burj Khalifa in which city? Yes, Dubai, highest building of the world. So as it's in Dubai, and it takes a lot of concrete to make that building, and concrete takes a lot of sand, it must have been quite easy for them, given that this is what they look at if they're on the top of Burj Khalifa in daytime. The biggest sand desert in the world, if you define by sand desert, really, is not Sahara, it's really the empty quarter just outside Dubai and Saudi Arabia. Well, what if I tell you that the sand used to build this one was imported from Australia because Dubai is running out of sand? Well, let me correct myself. Useful sand. Sand useful for construction. That would be a bit surprising, no? For some of you? No, not for you. You know the story already. But for some, it might be like, what? Well, the sand that you see here is just not useful for construction because it's too round, the grains. And the grains, it's basically, imagine you're like a bowl full of pebbles, and you put your hand in, you put it out, and you try to squeeze it. They will go all sides. You can't squeeze pebbles together. Same with rounded sand. But you need to be able to make them stick together for stability in concrete. And in the desert, these dunes are constantly moving, so they are always rolling over each other, so they're too round. So the world actually lives on a big fata morgana. We think we see the oasis, we think we see there is enough sand for all the things that we do, and it's the most mined material in the world, in ton. However, only some parts, a percentage of all the sand that we know of and see is useful for our economy, our society. And that's mostly the river sand, which is less rounded. However, if it ends up in the sea, like they have marine sands in front of Dubai, it gets mixed with salt. And salt, you need to wash it, or otherwise, if you mix it with your concrete and steel, the salt and the steel will not match well together. So then you need clean water to clean marine sand, which Dubai doesn't have a lot of, unless they go into desalination, which takes energy. And then, I mean, where does it end? So it ends with Dubai importing sand, because that makes more sense for them. Of course, if you then look at the total numbers for humanity, we now, in our global economy, use twice the amount of sand every year than all the rivers in the world produce new sand, including those in Northeast Siberia, which are hard to get at, right? So that means we are eating into our capital, which has been built up over millions of years of sand stock through all the rivers that exist. So one example of that is Singapore, another rich city-state. They just import from wherever they can get sand from. To do this, build new skyscrapers and banking institutions. They have expanded their territory of their country by 22% in half a century because of this. Well, they started small. But how the countries around Singapore, they suffered the consequences of this massive demand for sand. So Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, one by one, fishing communities were disturbed because of so much sand dredging in the rivers that the river became too, not polluted, but the sand was troubling the water, so that the fish migrated and they lost their source of income, so they protested. And one by one, these countries, somewhere in the 90s, they started saying, we do an export ban on sand because it's causing too much trouble, after which the mafia took over with illegal streams towards Singapore, including eliminating 24 islands of the country of Indonesia totally for export, after which they were underwater, and Singapore then told Indonesia, hey, we need to talk about the border because these 24 islands are no longer there. That really happened. So long story short, because I can talk 1 hour on the sand mafia and India alone, but whether it's wood or copper or sand, there is actually quite less than most of us think, and there is a quite fierce competition going on over what remains. So one guy who did some research into what climate scientists actually think if they are not bound by the limits of their peer-reviewed paper. And he interviewed 100 of them. Like, tell me your honest opinion. And well, it came out, an article in New York Times magazine, I think, and it was a bit darker than the usual IPCC reports. And we think of it as something slow, but it's quite fast, while the technological solutions for the problem are coming much slower than we usually think. To give an idea, sorry to be a bit gloomy about this, but even oxygen levels in the oceans are dropping because of climate change, leaving less and less oxygen for the animals there, leading to some saying that by 2080, most oceans will be basically, well, a lot of them will be rather dead. So in general, I feel like I can say these things to this audience because you're all smart people and you want to know and you want to improve the world as a scientist, I think. So we can be honest and blunt about state of play. But in general, I mean, I don't know how many conversations you would have like this with your uncle at the Christmas party, even before he's drunk. I'm not sure, but probably not a lot. So we need to find ways to somehow deal with this reality too. Like, this is really hard to discuss with the general public. So let me do a time check because I'm like halfway my slides. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, so I'm halfway my time. Cool. But I've been talking a lot. So before I move into the EU and what we're doing about it, let me check with you, clarification questions already. Extra things you want to know about all these. Actually, let me ask you, like, raise your hand if any of what I said was new, because I want to know if you all know everything already, then okay, it's making sense then, okay? Because yeah, you look also smart that I don't know how much you already know, so cool. So no more questions then? Yeah, please. Good question. No, it's not the top three of problematic commodities or something like that. Although sand is the biggest in ton and the largest environmental crime in the world is the sand mafia. It's actually bigger than the value of all environmental crimes aside from sand mafia combined. So we're estimated at 300 billion a year, and illegal wood is the second at 100 to 150 billion, and then like ivory trade is 10 billion. So to give you an idea of the size, sand is huge in terms of amount of conflicts it creates, amount of mafia, amount of copper is, of course, it's in so many of the things that we use, so it's also quite ubiquitous, or how do you call it? Yeah. A wood is maybe a more something specific. Yeah. Does that? Yeah. It's more like what I happened to learn about and found striking examples of the general trend towards more and more conflict over what remains of our valuable resources without the reaction of policymakers to really think in terms of sufficiency and how to limit these demands. It's rather about how can we grab the last pieces and compete with China and Russia and the US over them, instead of how can we have an economy that doesn't need that much of these resources. Yeah. Okay. Let me just take a sip. So what does it all mean for Europe/the EU? Well, here is the share that we are claiming for ourselves. And that's the share that we can still, on average, tolerate if all of humanity would claim it. That means in order to get from 2 to 12, we need a trick to lay a claim on the resources that other people also want. So Europe has 6% of the world population, but it uses 25% of the Earth's material resources, and for lithium, it's 35. However, what if like 1 billion people in China and India also would like to take some lithium? how is Europe then going to keep taking far more than its fair share? And that's when it enters the realm of geopolitics. And that's where the last years a lot has been shifting, tectonic shifts, I would say. So I did one, my latest book is a small one. It's basically the reaction on the Corona crisis, but from a meta perspective, like linking to this story, like what is it that we could learn if we dig deeper into how it was so easy for this virus to spread so fast and create so much damage? And it's partly linked to this grab for resources everywhere. But what I also did in this book is to have 3 chapters on geopolitics: China, the EU, the US/UK. And what I learned is through the Corona crisis, actually, China is not doing another Cold War like some people claim, like with the Cold War of the Soviet Union and US. That's not it. They are still taking revenge for the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars from 150 years ago, roughly, where the British and the French extracted things from China in very unjust ways, where they drugged the Chinese people with their opium from India and kept them under control like that. Through which, after 3,000 years of, well, ups and downs, but still quite powerful position in the world, yeah, China was really on its knees for like 100 years, 150. And now they're still catching up on that. And now they're turning the tables on us in a way, because they are basically with their €1 panda bears through Alibaba on Liège airport, keeping us addicted to their cheap stuff and thereby more and more controlling what we can do. And it's quite interesting that in the whole story of resources, people don't seem to grasp how much they are already under control of everything. For lithium, processing is already the vast majority in China. Now, Europe is suddenly, because of geopolitical crisis, like, oh, strategic autonomy, we need to open new mines in Europe, make battery factories and so forth and so forth. It's all quite too little too late, actually. If you look at Orban, Hungary, he recently invited Xi. So Xi, from China, he came to Europe. I think it was 4.5 days. Half a day Paris, 1 day Serbia, to remind everyone that NATO bombed the Chinese embassy and it wasn't okay. And then 3 days Hungary. And he signed billions and billions of deals for battery factories of Chinese companies and car factories for Chinese build your dream cars. And as that's in the EU can no longer do import taxes on Chinese electric cars because they're built in the EU. 44% of foreign investment from China in the EU goes to Hungary. 44%, let it sink in. I mean, he's already controlling that trade, basically. We're too late on that one. And just few people have come to grasp with how far this has already gone, I think. So now suddenly in France, for example, there is a lot of lithium in the ground. There are still some car makers. So suddenly Macron's like, oh, let's make the full value chain from mine to the electric vehicle in France, right? Well, there are some issues with that because a lithium mine also has a lot of water grabbing of like 50 kilometers around the mine through the ground layer. The water water tables will lower depending on the area, of course. And well, does France occasionally have a water shortage problem? A forest fire problem? Or also another last question, does it have like obeying citizens who never complain? I guess not. So if the best way to cause another revolution in France is to say we're going to open lithium mines everywhere and grab all your water and you can do nothing about it because we're going to cancel free, prior and informed consent. And in the Elysee, we're going to decide what to do. Well, good luck with that. So not going to happen. That's what I'm telling. And China has been on this for much longer than we are. Yeah, I told last week I did some opinion pieces in the Standard about the various things going on, but one of them is also, yeah, what stories do we tell? I don't know why the editor chose this picture, but maybe because she's telling a very different story. But for me, it's about we are sometimes so steered in one direction of the types of stories that we get presented through media that we forget that, like in China or in India, these other stories are very powerful, and they also have a lot of energy and steering the way the world goes. We're still very much Eurocentric in the stories that we think are the important stories. For example, we still think that we live in a hegemony of the US with some multipolar world, but it's still the US controlling everything, and the World Bank and the IMF, and they are the most powerful multilateral institutions, while in the same time, China and India, they are creating parallel multilateral institutions with actually more members and more trade going on than the World Trade Organization nowadays. So the number of patents, for example, it used to be the US #1. It's already many years that China is #1. They are no longer the copy house of the world. They are the inventors now. Again, I would say, because they have been for a long time in the history as well. But we tend to, follow the stories that we want to believe in, because they make us feel better. And that's, maybe also why people are now voting for Kamala, which has a better story than Joe, but she's still sending just as many bombs to Gaza as the other guy. And a lot of people in the US are also not going to have it, I think. But that's another story. I think we are now in the EU at paying the price for the end of a 500-year period in which we've taken more than what is actually just for us through violent means, through colonization, the imperialism, and so forth. Now, in the last few years, as China is telling us, we don't want your dirty plastic anymore, we're going to make our own cars and so forth, trade deals are unraveling. That also leads to inflation, which we are suffering from now already. In our reaction recently, we're talking about reshoring, the trend of 50 years of exporting the polluting industries to where the debt are cheaper, which is basically a quote from Lawrence Summers from the World Trade Bank, advisor of many US presidents. Yes. Oh, yes, 5 minutes. Cool. Quickly. So that's where we are now in Europe, moving from capitalism to cannibalism in a metaphorical sense. We're just trying to now grab our own last resources at the expense of our own people. However, a lot of people are trying to resist and fight back. And for that, we need first imagination and then knowledge. Sorry, because I know you're all into knowledge. But we also really need the big thinking. And so we did a report with the European Environment Bureau 4 years ago, 5 years by now. And it's still the most cited report from the European environment movement in the last 5 years. Decoupling debunked. Even Belgian school kids are now, the teachers in the learning plan, in the curriculum, are advised to read this report, just the latest news. And it really talks about, well, forget about all this green growth narrative and myth and policies, because it's not working. You can't like put some green paint on the evergreen tanker. It still blocks itself in the Suez Canal. So we're trying to frame different stories of post-growth or beyond growth or even degrowth, depending on the audience you talk to, because some audience is more ready for one word than for another. 6 years ago, the first conference in European Parliament, we had 3 days, Kate Raworth, Tim Jackson, like 200 people, I think 8 MEPs, members of European Parliament. Beyond Growth was the biggest conference of the whole 5 years of Ursula von der Leyen in the European Parliament. If you missed it, some of you were there, Beyond Growth? Yeah, I see someone nodding, cool. If you've missed it, all the speeches are online. There were, how many people? 2,000? There were 5,000 online, 150 speakers, and it was massive. I did one debate there with Kate Raworth, the chief economist of the European Commission, the CEO of Umicore, big company, and an MEP from Germany, to really discuss the limits of this circular economy and the need to frame them within sufficiency and beyond growth policy making. And to help with this imagination, we distributed 1,500 of these copies, and they were gone by lunchtime the first day. I still have 2 of them here, with all kinds of experts from governments, from science, explaining what they mean when they say beyond growth. We do with NGOs letters in a dialogue with chief economists from the commission, because I mean they can't always publicly say what they would like to say because they're still answering to a boss politically. But in private, we know that some of them are really eager to. They look sometimes at us like, help us to make the case in my commission to change in a more radical way, because I mean, if you don't write these letters and do these debates and put pressure on us, who am I to go to my boss and say we need beyond growth? So there are people in the commission willing to listen to these arguments. That's interesting, but we need to use that window that we have. So yeah, IPCC, you all know that. Even they are now on board with degrowth. They mentioned it a couple of times in the SICT assessment. In this case, it's about reduction of primary input, reduction of raw materials. So very quickly now, I have like 9 more slides, so I'm going to go a bit over time, sorry. Levels of change. We have change in the niches, change in the regimes, the current policies that we have, the NGO work, and change at the cultural level, the stories that we tell each other and that we want to follow and believe in society. So I've been working on all these 3 levels in the last 15 years with like these little video clips of looking at the pandemic from these meta lens TED Talks. And then this regime is typical NGO work. It's like by ministry, by topic, and it's biased often because you need KPIs to show off. You need to count and show to the funders how you're doing. But you can still do some stuff like these letters. And then the niches, I founded a cycling cooperative, like you see at the bottom left, in Leuven, where we are now replacing trucks who enter the city center with these kind of bikes. And in 1 year, we already have 10 people cycling and a few tons of CO2 evaded. So another nice niche is an example of specifically for resources. I have little video clips of this if you want to watch it online. Maakfabriek. It's in Antwerp, where 80 people have their little place in a common area where they use all kind of leftovers from the second-hand shop next door that they can't sell anymore, and then they upcycle the material into stuff that's still usable. Same in Leuven, you have the materials bank. They also use, like from wharves, they scrap the usable wood or stonework, and then they sell it in their shop for upcycling materials. So there are niches already there, and they should still grow. And part of my job in Leuven now is to make sure that these niches grow. But we also need change at this regime level, the policy level, and at the cultural level. These 3, they interact with each other. You can't just solve the global problems with some islands of oases of nice little niches alone. You need all 3. So they are nice, but the big environmental issue of today is rationing in a time of resource depletion and global increasing conflict over access to what remains. And that's just the reality, whether we like it or not, whether we think, oh, Nick, that's very communist of you to say, well, I don't care. I'm just sharing the reality. By the way, economic system is not a light switch between capitalism and communism, but I don't think I need to explain that to this audience. So we have at the EEB and also at CATAPA, the EEB is European Environment Bureau, developed a few things on the relation between what I just gave in a very brief snapshot, extractivism and the position of Europe, and the rise of digital ICT and so forth. So this is an unpublished, however, if you email me, I can send it to you, but a kind of draft of talking points that in the environmental movement were at one point gathered on the relation between raw materials and ICT. And then this is an example of CATAPA. They are doing great work in Belgium. Who knows CATAPA? Nobody? Yeah, a few. So they are a small NGO in Belgium linked with South American activists resisting mining mostly. But they have made this bigger meta picture as well. They are also advocating for degrowth because they see the link between that and the pressure on all these mining conflicts. And they have some EU projects on ICT. So one of them is called Make ICT Fair, with reports and blogs about human rights in the ICT world, or now a campaign, Control Alt Delete, on making ICT fair. Tiny example, the Fairphone that I have since ages is an example of how even in ICT you can do good things using the only labeled or a fair trade gold mine in the world, for example. But yeah, to end with maybe one more Hollywood movie after The Inconvenient Truth, which was throughout my presentation. And with Avatar, I think a lot of us can relate to what these two scientists in the front were trying to convey as a message. Who has seen this film? Oh, yeah, of course. Most of you. If you haven't seen it, don't look up. It really is about the state of the world today and what we as truth-seeking scientists trying to help the world need to face up to and fight at, whether it's president or media. I learned a lot actually from that movie. It helped me to, I don't know, give my feelings about these frustrations a better place. I've seen it 3 times already, I think. So that's my therapy. And I want to offer my therapy to you as well. So yeah, I'm going to wrap it up here and open the floor to you.
We'll go into questions. There's one here, one in the back. Yes, and now it's working.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I checked your
Thank you.
profile. I saw you in Leuven. I'm also in Leuven, so I want to reconnect. I have one question. I think you made a very compelling argument about the strategic underpinnings of growth and so on and so forth. And then when you move on with degrowth, how do you take into account those strategic aspects that were also touched upon in the morning presentation? Well, if we go for degrowth, how strong are we towards external actors such as China, the US, others?
Yeah, that's an eternal question. And Olivia Lazard, for example, from Carnegie Institute, has specialized on that question, like the interrelationship between degrowth and geopolitical rising tensions. She has a great TED talk on that. Basically, if we organize our economy in a way that we require less raw material input in order for having a good life for most, if not all, Europeans, by, for example, half through sufficiency policies, then we just depend less on finding access to a lithium mine in Africa where China and Russia are also competing with us, because we don't need it that much anymore. So I think degrowth is just one way to reduce conflict and tensions and no longer need this competitive resource grab for the rest of the world anymore. And I do think strategic autonomy is, is something necessary. I mean, yeah, let's be real. I mean, if I were in China or in India and I know my history a bit, oh boy, I would be into revenge as well. So if my leaders are into that frame and that narrative, I don't think we as 6% of the world population, Europeans, will be able to do much about it. So it's wise to be strategic autonomy, but it's unwise to do it if you're still needing that much input, because what's going to happen then? Yeah, Europe is densely populated. We have some protections for the environment. These will then be all through the gutter. And then there's going to be a lot of resistance and revolutions in Europe of people saying, oh, hey, sorry, but we're not having it. Case in point, France. So France, until somewhere 50, 60 years ago, they had 200 uranium mines in the hexagon, France itself, not abroad. Of course, uranium mines, cancers, pollution, trouble, resistance, loss, they closed. But the nuclear power didn't close. So they opened in Niger. And Niger mine is 40% of their supply of uranium until trouble started there, rebels, Mali, sending in the army. Then the Russians came, kicked out the French basically, and now their supply is cut off. However, because they didn't reduce the electricity demand in their country, now they're a bit screwed because they haven't like applied the degrowth way of strategic autonomy, which would be organizing the economy that you need half of the amount of electricity. And by the way, that doesn't mean that you need to halve your electricity amount. I mean, to the contrary, there is a lot of inequality in energy use, whether it's the affluent, which are, I mean, over-consuming by a factor crazy more, or whether it's certain industrial activities that require this energy, which we maybe should be looking at phasing out. Making raw new virgin plastics, throwaway plastics, why aren't we phasing out that sector? That would also take less energy, thus less need for sending in army in to protect the uranium mine in Niger. So it's all connected. And degrowth doesn't contradict, I think, the tensions that are rising. It's actually one of the smarter answers, I think. Also a misunderstanding, sometimes people think, yeah, but degrowth, are you telling poor people in Zimbabwe that they need to degrow? No, it's the opposite. It's for them to be able to just develop their own way, and for us to put less pressure and grabbing away from their opportunity, that we need to be looking at degrowth in the more economies which are overdeveloped in a way. So that to create the breathing space, the living space for others. So it is a very social program or proposal. There's a whole academic movement around it. I followed the degrowth conferences since 2008 in Barcelona, and then Leipzig and Budapest every 2 years, and it just kept growing. The number of research papers is just exponentially growing, and that's the one growth which I think we all like. Does that answer sort of? We could talk 1 hour about it, but yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Mine is unfortunately quite similar to this one. So maybe I can just push a bit more on this relation between growth and resource extraction and competition in a multipolar world. Because I think a lot of parts of green growth makes sense to citizens, because they imagine more competition for resources. That means you need more surplus. If China comes and says, I'm giving you 300 euros to buy this lithium, and Europe does not have growth, you would say like, okay, we can't really access those resources anymore. So degrowth has one, or as you said, you can change the name, but it has one part of the solution, which is like, hey, we should already consume less. But I think what people are very, stressed and don't see necessarily the solution is we already see a decrease in the amount of purchasing power that Europe has. In general, there is less ability for Europe to go and impose its way, which is good. We shouldn't impose stuff. But then there is this relation, and I think this is why people are saying, well, if we come by it abroad, we need to bring it back home. I find that there is sometimes a lack of grappling with some geopolitical and a bit of nasty pricing behaviors when we talk about degrowth. So if you would like to talk a bit about this.
Well, you have a good point. I mean, neither the grabbing away is the solution, nor the opening up tons of new mines in Europe is the solution. And I think most of the degrowth movement or academics in there are very much aware of that, and trying to work on showing how through policy reductions, you don't need either of the two anymore, or you can upcycle what's already in the economy. An example is with cars. We're going for electric cars now, which means more lithium everywhere. However, shared carring system, which I've been using forever, not private car, is 6 times less to 7 times less number of cars, which are 90% sitting still and rotting away. 6 times less means 6 times less mining and conflicts and purchasing power needed to grab somebody else's resources or to open a new mine in somewhere where people are protesting because their water is gone. 6 times. But then you need policymakers who act accordingly, who don't just go by the market and by everyone's own choice, and private carship is like as if it's a human right. It's not a human right. So forget about it. I mean, cities, they give licenses to park cars just anywhere in the public space. Well, maybe we should no longer do that. Or, I mean, there are ways to tackle that problem of cars in a very different way through, if you apply the degrowth mindset in that specific aspect, and then have 6 times less need for lithium.
So this is kind of the problem. It's the way that Europe has been using industry, like before resources, but when you sell the finished product, you also get more money for more resources. It's a capitalistic model. Once you start saying, well, we won't make those cars, the problem is that then you don't have the surplus. That means then you can buy less in a competitive world. I think it works very well in a world where we're all friends, but I think it's a bit hard when you're competing with China. That's the point. In a way, we need to bring China in, or we need to compete. Sometimes it's a conflict of wants.
Competitive, yes, but maybe, yeah, we need to produce something ourselves. I agree on that. And if you call competition that we produce for our market in the EU and China produces for their market and maybe also for exporting, if you call that competition, then yes, that's probably going to be needed. I'm sorry, I don't have the full answer maybe, but we'll still need some surplus, of course. We're not saying that let's all go back to the cave and forget about GDP and forget about the economy in general. No, some production is needed, but there is so much that can be done. Yeah, on the other end of the demand side, of the choice editing, basically, of steering in a direction where we can live well with the resources that we have. But the market is not going to do that. That's the problem.
I just have a small point of intervention. We're going to run a little bit over time before we go to lunch because we started a little bit later. And this would also be an interesting continuation in the panel.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm not sure I fully understood when you spoke about the relationship between China engaged in a fierce competition with EU or even in an economic war and the Opium War. Are you saying that we should take into account the cultural heritage of this harm and that it's probably one of the ingredients of the reason they are in this competition in that way? Or is this a stronger statement saying that there is an active relationship between that event and what they are doing now that would be almost as strong as just they are in a competition because we are in a world that's made for competition? And
on your first bit, which I understand better, is I would definitely say yes. We underestimate the level of emotional, historical importance of the how do you call it in English? The unjust way the world has treated China 150 years ago still has a role today. And I'm reminded now of another example in which I think it was Sarkozy, who, when he was president of France, and he was in Algeria for making some big multi-billion-dollar deal, and it was all set. The president was already in the capital. Normally, it's just a matter of signing, and suddenly the president or whatever of Algeria told Macron, d'abord des excuses. First you apologize, and then we'll sign the deal. And that was like for what happened in 1960s, of course. And that's still alive and kicking, especially in China. They have a long history and they have a long mindset. Should we take it into account? I mean, how can you take it into account? I don't know. I don't think it's suddenly everything is going to improve and we're all friends if suddenly the world apologizes for the Opium Wars. That's also not going to happen. But it happened, and I think it plays a bigger role with them because they feel humiliated. That's the word. They have been humiliated with Hong Kong, with Macau, with a lot of these colonies from the British. Yeah, and now they're turning the tables. They're one by one. Hong Kong is already back with them, taking back what was taken from them. And also in terms of addiction, the West or the British made their populace addicted and thus controlled them. And in terms of addiction, I think they have been good now at making us addicted to cheap products from China, and thus controlling more and more of us. So that's why I call it like they are still turning the tables on the opium war. It's a bit of a metaphor. It's not in day to day that they're discussing of how to take revenge of the opium. That's not, I mean, but it does play more role than most of us seem to know, because we don't know our history as well as leadership in China knows their history. They don't need to fight elections, right? So they're just always, whenever it's the leader in China, they think of what's my role in the whole history of 3,000 years going to be? What's my mark? It's not about how I will win the next election. They don't have any. So for Xi, the end game is Taiwan. That's clear. I mean, he's not going to stop unless he dies, until that's part of China again, like it used to be for him, their version. Yeah. So.
Oh, thank you so much for great enlightening talk. So I completely agree, and I think this whole audience completely agrees with degrowth and so forth. But we have to act in a world where the economic model is a model of growth, right? And in capitalism, and it's at the world scale, it's even at the small country scale. The whole Belgium system is built on economic growth. How our pensions are being paid by having more and more people employed. So how to connect those two? That's a big puzzle for me. I'm not an economist by any means, but that's really bugging me.
Yeah, there is a huge gap between what's needed and what we can do now. I agree. And there is the debt system, right? So we are in the debt trap. Actually, just now, this year in April, European leaders agreed on, let's go back to austerity, to the Maastricht rules, which is the most foolish decision they could have taken, I think, according to a lot of economists, because we need a lot of new investments to get out of the mess we've created with the environment. And now we're going to stop that. So that's why in Belgium, we're looking for 27 billion. That's not there. And we're looking for the ill people and the old people to get the money from. But it's the same parties who voted in favor of this austerity in April in Europe. That's what one of my opinion pieces recently. So yeah, we're trapped in a way, and we're not going to escape the trap like big time unless we have, like David Graeber wrote, 5,000 years of debt, or debt the first 5,000 years, a massive debt jubilee. Because without a debt jubilee, which we should have had in 2015 with Greece, then there was an occasion to say, okay, let's start with maybe not a clean sheet, but something like it, like we've had every 50, 60 years on average over the last 5,000 years. And then we could look at, okay, now that we've done that and we've all agreed in at least in Europe, we could have done that in the EU zone. Let's all take a hit, although, I mean, most of the debts are to each other in the EU. So that wouldn't have been that massive. And then we can start with a clean sheet and invest in the things that we need. So it's going to take an even bigger crisis than the one of Greece in 2015, including street mobilizations all over Europe, like close to anarchy, before the debt trap is solved and we get into what we last had in Munich in 56, I think, in which case the Greeks told the Germans, it's okay, 90% of what you owe us, you can leave it. Well, we're going to have to do something big like that before we can actually get real with the whole degrowth thing. And until we do, there are still smaller things we can do, which are maybe niches, but we can enact sufficiency policies in the built environment, for example, or we can fight back against fast fashion and just like sector by sector and policy by policy, try to, like 2 years ago, Nord Stream blew up, energy crisis. Europe told every country 15% less energy this year. That's a degrowth policy. It took a Nord Stream explosion to do it. But we should capitalize on it, saying, look, it's possible. They did it. I mean, it's there in the graphs, but now we need to do it. We don't need to wait for another sabotage terrorist act before we should do this. So there are like little, like cool food in Dutch, crowbars lying around that we need to identify and yeah, use in our lobby work with policy making, and wait. And I mean, that's the one thing where I agree with Milton Friedman, the neoliberal pope, is our job is to be ready for when the crisis hits. And we just need to have the plan ready. So when Katrina hit, bam, the next day, the School of Chicago was there. When Allende was in a coup, the next day, Hayek was on a plane to tell Pinochet what to do. We need to be, our job is to be ready. When tomorrow a big thing happens, we have our degrowth policies for every single sector, how to do it. We have already spoken with those who are like in power, but below the top, you know, who are ready for this. Like the chief economist from the commission, he was in this debate. He understands it. He just can't do it now. So that's our job. And then, yeah, we do what we can. We see where we end. What else can we do?
Okay. We do one more question because Lars is not here yet, and then
Yeah, my luck. I would be interested in your perspective on the sustainable development, development in the global south narrative. If we think of the World Bank and other institutions that are still promoting the manufacturing-led growth, I was speaking about it earlier this week, then you can see that there's a lot of hope in the industrial development in let's say African countries, and the jobs it will bring, and the economic prosperity that it may bring according to the people who promote it. What's your maybe alternative model in the context of degrowth that you think could be viable in these contexts?
Yeah, so there are a few things together here. I'm not sure which one to pick, but maybe I'll start with the World Trade Organization, where in the last few years, the US is no longer appointing judges for the dispute settlement mechanism of the World Trade Organization, meaning if you do something that's illegal in the World Trade Organization rules, you can get away with it now, because there is no more a functioning correctional justice system because the US is no longer appointing judges to it. So actually, it's an empty body already, meaning trade conflicts are on the rise because people think we can, whether we signed up to WTO or not, there is no more correction mechanism. So it's being replaced already in the last years by, what's it called, the Shanghai Cooperation Mechanism, the Asian Development Bank, and all these Belt and Road Initiative, all these Asian, basically, multilateral institutions in which more and more African countries also join. We just still pretend as if the World Trade Organization is the big thing. So that's maybe a part of your, but then the other question was more, I think, if I get it right, like, what about African countries wanting industrialization and jobs, right? I'm not, who is they wanting them? I mean, are you talking about some of the leaders who are often, corrupted and who are just using the system for their personal enrichment and not for the benefit of their population? Or are you talking about the fishermen in the Niger Delta who have seen the consequences of industrialization and jobs, with Shell doing a lot of damage and killing their environment big scale for decades, because they don't want industrialization and then jobs. They want to be like left alone from this world. And there are a lot of places also in Africa that are like, I mean, often giving them the opportunity to develop in their own way means taking away the destruction of opportunity that's currently there through industrialization controlled by first the West, now China, United Arabian Emirates, who also operate Brazil, all kind of land grabbing mega farms and mines in Africa. It's opportunities are not necessarily created with this new mine, they are also destroyed. And a lot of people know that and would like to develop in other ways than that. So it's a matter of who you're talking to. Actually, one more to end with, there is more financial flow from Africa to out of Africa through illegal financial flows than there is incoming flow from development aid. And it's a factor more. So tax paradises, tax havens are a factor bigger of a problem for Africa than all the development aid coming in together can do well for them. So often the bigger hurdle towards development is a bit hidden from what most people see and know. But in this audience, I'm not saying that much new, but yeah. Thank you.
Well, thanks. A big round of applause for Nick.